Hello to Nursing 531 class. Dr. Hastings here. Hope all are good. This week, week 3, module 3, nursing education. Now I put history perspectives versus historical perspective. I just like the word history. A walk down history. In this case, we're looking at the evolution of nursing education from the curricular appreciation perspective and thinking about design and implementation. So within this, the key dates in this lecture sequence relate to that. Now there's other good frames of reference relative to history, hence I provided a web link we actually use in an undergraduate course for nursing concepts from the University of Pennsylvania. It is a fabulous, again, block by block, period by period review from the earlier to middle 1800s through current on nursing education. And that's a little bit more global. It's not focused on curriculum per se, just big, let's just say, hallmarks that are key to the profession. So I think it's really worth a look-see why I put that up there under the week 3 links. And I'd also put up a webinar that I think is quite appropriate relative to our learning. So definitely take a look at that. I think it provides perspective in terms of where we are now, how we've gotten here, but getting us to a point relative to how we appreciate graduate education at this juncture. And some of the themes associated with how do we understand better what the curricular expectations and foundations related to scope and standards of practice, but what should be, again, this theme, baseline competencies for practice. And at the generalist or undergraduate level, of course, we've had questions and continue to have a question this week relative to minimum competency for proficiency in clinical practice at that level, i.e., should the baccalaureate or the BSN be the minimum competency? But there are those pressures that move this even farther to think, gee, maybe the doctoral level should be minimum competency, like we see in other clinical practice areas, like pharmacy and like physical therapy and like occupational therapy. So I think we want to think at the at least current level of where we are, at least get the baccalaureate consideration grounded, but then think more about what about the future. Should we have clinical doctorates in place as well? So the discussion question links really to that BSN level of competency. We don't have consensus on that even. We're still very split. And there's references even in this lecture to the idea of a civil war that's been going on in nursing. That's been going on for 100 years. So no question about it. We need to think broadly, and we should have a lively discussion about this. But for this lecture content, so when we talk about history, I have some foundation hallmarks that are listed on the PowerPoint. Again, the UPenn site does far more justice, but specific more to nursing education and to curriculum. And Billings and Halstead only refers to these things briefly, so that's why I put a little bit more context into a lecture, and we have in our curriculum for this class a section on this. So thinking about, again, summary, basic context, the early schools were really thinking not so much about a detailed curriculum with goals and outcomes in mind, except in the context of the idea of behaviors as being a focus and effect then too. So the ownership there for hospital systems owning the graduates then too, and being a byproduct of their institutions is important. So we didn't really see nursing coming into its own as a profession. It was not differentiated from the role of women as family caretakers. So, of course, the expectations were relatively low in these early programs. And they were guided, by and large, by physicians at one level. So that's a key consideration. So we didn't have until 1885 Clara Weeks having a textbook focusing on nursing and the use of nursing training schools, families, and private students. But let's just say the whole notion about, a physician authoring these kind of books, I mean, again, there's going to be a bias relative to that then too. So beyond the behaviors and the character themes, what are we thinking about in terms of having to move forward? Training, the expectations there, and the outcomes that were needed. So we want competency, obviously. So really, not until 1893, when Isabel Hampton authored Educational Standards for Nurses, do we have some clarity from a nursing perspective about how this should run. So we think about how this fed into important organizations like NLN at its foundation in support of a professionalism within the notion of what nursing is beyond an occupation. So Hampton had two good works, the second one being that nursing is principles and practice for hospital and private use. Really good in terms of extending, nursing beyond the hospital, but also in the community setting. And with the idea that there needed to be a curriculum plan that would take place over time for a couple of years at least to provide, again, lectures and clinicals that would serve to train nurses in an appropriate way. When we had the American Hospital Association make a recommendation too, it showed that there were hospital leaders and administrators that were starting to pay attention to the importance of quality and competency relative to nurse training. So this was a positive thing, and trying to see how there were ways to, again, ground people who were ready to care for patients in a hospital setting, let alone the idea also differentiate that from another type of nurse who's more the private duty type in the community setting. So in all this, general recommendations really did refer to minimum standards at this level, but better than where we were, for sure, just 30, 40 years before that. So specialization was critical, relative to institutional settings. And I think a big consideration here, why I put in italics at the end, the establishment of the subcommittee is an early example of attention paid by these administrators and nursing leaders to deficiencies. They saw, let's just say, gaps in quality, and they really needed to consider, from their perspective, some kind of standardization and minimum competencies to really drive good care, good care provision, good practice. So in all this, as we evolve into the 1900s and rolling into the 20th century, we're cognizant of the fact that nursing schools needed to grow then too, and they needed to show within their structure some sense of good oversight. But again, fairly modest, okay, at one level in terms of the grades that were received early on relative to the base structure, the foundation of these. So certainly there were some key concerns that were elucidated based on some bullet points that I laid out here, that there needed to be a growth in terms of educational background supporting those who were running nursing programs. And they elevated from the mid-teens to the mid-20s in terms of just greater proficiency. By the 30s, the idea that at least nurse educators need to have some level of college in the mix was an important consideration. All right. And then beyond, some of the reports that you're probably cognizant of, the Goldmark report from 1923 that referred to the idea that nursing education should be primarily grounded in academic settings in colleges as opposed to hospital apprenticeship type of models, again, initially run by physician oversight. And that we saw, again, academic institutions growing nursing programs, in effect, too. And Columbia had a great emphasis early on with their hospital economics course and things like that were add-ons for trained nurses. But then you saw nursing taking off with the Bolton School at Case Western Reserve and Yale, University of Chicago, some eminent institutions that are adopting a well-structured nursing education program. So that's really important that we saw that evolution from this period into World War II, to which we had some novel funding that occurred during that period of time then too, to elevate the profession during wartime. That's on the UPenn site. Look at 1943, very interesting. Nursing curricula was transformed in the latter half of the 20th century, and that was really important. NLN had important efforts and grounding that supported higher education as taking the lead in nursing education. However, the Civil War in nursing was starting to escalate at another level then too. Though we had better consensus and some baseline competencies, a new model to support the need for hospitals, which were in a big growth mode in the 50s, was the idea of, again, not a 4-year type of program, but a 2-year, the associate's level program. And unfortunately, that has fragmented nursing for a long period of time and continues to really. So the ADN, cost-effective, short-term, easy feeder for hospital systems evolved. And I'm very transparent. I'm a product of that. So I don't want to say that it's necessarily a bad thing for healthcare, but it's a bad thing for our identity in nursing. That's something to think about as we're doing our discussion question moving forward. But other good things were taking place in terms of better defining the educational preparation needed and attention to expanded roles, including nurse practitioners and CRNAs and that type of thing. We knew we needed to expand the ability to provide health care beyond physician limitations and in terms of access and what nursing could do to support or complement that. So at least there was a vision that was unfolding in a very positive way in that respect. So the attention to the idea of, again, vocational or technical nurses differentiated from baccalaureate and higher degrees, which is still raging now, of course. So within this, let's just say that Civil War has been divisive at one level, but the attention paid at least one level of the differentiation between the types of nurses that exist, that we're going towards graduate education at one level. So we can differentiate between minimum competencies in terms of variety and flavor, technical versus professional. So that's important, especially for the career upwardly professional nurses who do get a baccalaureate and go on for graduate training. Okay, so in all this, let's just say we saw an evolution in higher education nursing, not just at the baccalaureate level, but now at the graduate level. For the PhD, for Doctor of Nursing Science, and then for the DNP, we saw now other opportunities for nursing to grow and evolve in scholarly ways and in advanced practice ways. Very important consideration there. So in summary, and I put another AACN link here that also provides some context for the impact of this. We see the landscape of healthcare being changed as nursing profession evolved, and that vision to be able to provide professional competencies at the level of acutely ill individuals in hospital settings, let alone community-based settings, but also now within scope and practice defined, looking at CNSs and NPs and CRNAs, how they have met a need that healthcare was struggling with in terms of having enough physicians to cover healthcare needs of the population. So this is really important, relative to how we are not just the largest healthcare providers, but we complement others. And I think when we talk about interprofessional education, we'll touch upon this again. So doctoral programs, since you folks are in graduate level programs now, let's just refer to this, that they have developed, okay, and they've helped clarify our professional identity that we are professionals, despite the muddying of the associate's level RN degree that I mentioned before. And understanding we're going to have some variation in curriculum, but I think the clarity now is moving toward what is a research-based doctorate, i.e. PhD, versus a clinically based doctorate, DNP, that practice doctorate. It has another dimension. It's a positive thing for our profession. So, all right, so I hope you enjoy, again, the interaction this week and the context, and have a great week, and I'll see you online.